Hello and welcome to this presentation covering the Catholic side of the life of Charles Waterton. It's been put together as part of the Wallfest 2026 celebrations to mark the 200th anniversary since the completion of the wall around Waterton's estate in Walton. It's also part of our celebrations marking 200 years since the building of St Austin's Wakefield, a Catholic church that was built with help from Charles Waterton. We should start by considering where Charles may have been baptised. And we haven't found any records confirming this, but there are some clues. Charles's older sister, Catherine, was born in 1781 and baptised in a small Catholic chapel in Little Blake Street, now Duncan Place, in York, shown on the photograph on the left. Her mother's parents were the Bedingfelds, and they lived a few streets away, which probably accounts for this location being chosen for the baptism. There's no record of Charles being baptised here, though, despite the records from his birth time surviving. Around the time of Charles's birth, the Catholics in Pontefract were celebrating Mass in a house in Horsefair. The current St Joseph's Church, shown on the right, was only established in 1806. But the baptismal register from the previous Mass house was transferred there when it opened. This register records Charles's brother Christopher being baptised in December 1787 and his sister Isabella in June 1792. It also records the sad death of their older sister Catherine, who died aged only 17 in January 1798. So collectively these records suggest that the Waterton family was attending Mass in Pontefract during this general period. As the surviving registers only start in the year 1784, and this was 2 years after the birth of Charles, it's entirely possible that Charles was baptised here too, and that the earlier registers were lost and no longer exist. Another possibility, of course, is that Charles was baptised at the hall itself. We know that Waterton was very proud of his illustrious ancestors and that he was connected to many other Catholic families. We've heard that his mother was a Bedingfeld, his grandmother was from the Moore family, and Charles mentions more than once that he was descended from the martyr St Thomas More. The Watertons had produced no less than 10 knights over the years, and the family had mixed with royalty and nobility. Sir John Waterton was Master of the Horse to Henry V, while Sir Robert Waterton was Governor of Pontefract Castle when Richard II was imprisoned there. Watertons had been involved in the Battle of Agincourt and the Wars of the Roses, and later, during the Civil War, Thomas Waterton lost his life while fighting for the king at Marston Moor. They had once owned land in Lincolnshire, a hall in Methley, and there's a stone sarcophagus in the parish church of Methley commemorating them. All this changed at the Reformation, however, when the Watertons refused to support King Henry VIII. The king wrote to Robert Waterton, "Waterton, I will take thy estate, but I will save thy life. Henry Rex." As a result of the Watertons' refusal to conform, Charles tells us, "My ancestors have been most cruelly assailed for centuries by every man in power, from the Prime Minister of England down to the county magistrate. Up to the reign of Henry VIII, things had gone swimmingly for the Watertons, and it does not appear that any of them had been in any disgrace. But during the sway of that ferocious brute, there was a sad reversal of fortune. The cause of our distress was briefly this. The king fell scandalously in love with a buxom lass, and he wished to make her his lawful wife, notwithstanding that his most virtuous queen was still alive. Having applied to the head of the church for a divorce, his request was not complied with. Having caused himself to be made head of the church, he suppressed all the monasteries and squandered the revenues amongst gamesters, harlots, mountebanks, and apostates. Sir Waterton was no fan of Henry VIII, referring to him frequently as Harry VIII, our royal goat. In his somewhat sarcastic prayer for the good dissenting brethren, he wrote, "I pray for them, for they have made a tyrant king the church's head, and let him waste the sacred treasures mid rogues and knaves in filthy pleasures." Queen Elizabeth was next in line for Waterton's literary fury. He wrote, "Elizabeth kept the Queen of the Scots in prison for 19 years and then murdered her. The supposed chastity of this law church she-pope will not bear investigation." And in another poem, he had the ghost of Queen Elizabeth I appearing to Church of England bishops, a little bit like Jacob Marley in A Christmas Carol, to warn them of the errors of their ways. "Whilst you bishops here are boasting of the Reformation tricks, my poor soul is burnt and roasting on the other side of Styx. See me punished for the measures which I followed while on earth, when I stole the sacred treasure and to church by law gave birth." He also had problems with William III, sometimes called William of Orange, and he wrote, "James II was a Catholic, but with fear of this before their eyes they deprived him of his hereditary crown, and called him from Holland William III, a mean and cruel Dutchman, to reign over them." As this is Wallfests, let's come to our first link to the wall. We know that Waterton built his wall to protect the wildlife on his estate from poachers and foxes. One of his biographers, Temple, wrote in 1945, "No gun was ever allowed to be fired here, and Walton Hall became the safest place in the land for all God's creatures, except possibly man and the brown or Hanoverian rat." Waterton had a lifelong hatred of the prolific brown rat, which, according to popular Catholic legend, had first travelled to England on the same ship as the Protestant King William of Orange. Waterton devoted much of his time to catching and eradicating the Hanoverian rats on his estate, sometimes with unseemly delight. One of his biographers, Julia Blackburn, alleges that on one occasion he was seen swinging a brown rat round and round by its tail and smashing its head against a stone with the battle cry, "Death to all Hanoverians." He kept a team of cats devoted to rat catching and cooked up delicious mixtures of porridge and treacle laced with arsenic to lure the rats to their doom. He bricked up the holes and barricaded floors, walls and tunnels in and around his house. He devised elaborate and complicated traps just to outwit the brown rat, and on one occasion he proclaimed triumphantly that the Hanoverians had been vanquished from his land forever, only to have the rats return later from neighbouring estates. Now, during Charles's lifetime, things were changing for the better for most Catholics. In 1829, when the Act of Roman Catholic Emancipation was passed, it did ease many of the rules and restrictions on Catholics and allowed them to take up government offices in return for swearing an oath of allegiance. This was known as Robert Peel's oath, after the man who created it. You can see them on the screen here. But when the oath was debated in the House of Lords in March 1838, a letter was read out by the Bishop of Exeter, which had been written as an open letter by Waterton. In it he said, "Catholic emancipation has done nothing worth speaking of for me, for I can neither be a member of Parliament nor a magistrate. No entreaty, no power on earth shall make me take Peel's oath. If I understand the English language, and I ought to understand it, for I was with the Jesuits till I was 20 years old, I say that Peel's oath binds me before Almighty God to abjure any intention to subvert the present church establishment. Now I will do everything in my power, fairly and honourably as a gentleman, to upset that church as by law established. He decided that the pen and his power of his own speech was mightier than the sword. This verbal, literary and creative skill was used to good measure against his opponents in the Protestant Reformation Society when they launched a series of lectures against Catholicism in Wakefield in the mid-1830s. Charles's intention to subvert the present church establishment manifest in various different ways. First, there was his creative taxidermy, which he took pleasure in using to humiliate the leaders of the Reformation, depicting Martin Luther as a monkey, John Knox as a frog, Elizabeth I as a lizard, and so on. In the words of his good friend Dr. Hobson, he jocosely and practically represented many individuals who took an active part in the Church Reformation by means of a substantial illustration composed of the most disgusting creatures that his flight of fancy could conceive, from the animal, nay, from the loathsome reptilian creation. Shown here on the slide is an AI reproduction of his work, The Reformation Zoologically Illustrated. The actual taxidermy itself has been lost, but this illustration, which is based on descriptions from the time, give a rough idea of what it may have looked like. From 1835 onwards, there were a series of lively theological debates in Wakefield, largely resulting from visits from members of the Protestant Reformation Society. They sent speakers to Wakefield to preach to the population on the errors of popery. Waterton and his friends were almost always present and very vocal in their defence of their religion. On one such occasion, Waterton had proclaimed, "I will forfeit my life before I allow myself or my religion to be insulted in a public courthouse by any man, be he paid or unpaid for giving the insult." He published long letters of rebuttal and reprimand, copies of which still exist in Wakefield museums and archives collections. And of course, he liaised with his friend Father Morris of St. Austin's, who gave a series of public sermons in response to the visitors' claims. So let's talk a little bit about the Jesuits, because this order was very important to Charles. The Jesuits, or Society of Jesus, are a Catholic religious order with a particular interest in education. Although they became very popular in Europe, their work in Britain was limited by the penal laws following the Reformation. But many Jesuits still ministered here despite the very real threat to their lives. They were seen as a particular threat to the established order and associated with foreign Catholic governments. Stonyhurst, pictured here, became their school and headquarters in England from around 1794, and Charles himself attended the school there for many years. Prior to this, Jesuits had served as chaplains to the Waterton family at Walton Hall, celebrating Mass in secret during penal times despite the very real dangers. One of them, Father Thomas Petre, was captured and spent time in York Castle dungeons. Another, Father Thomas Moore, S.J., who was a descendant of the martyr of the same name and the cousin of Charles's Father Thomas, spent a lot of time at Walton Hall. Sir Rowland Wynne, who lived at Nostell Priory, had the task of catching priests at the time, but despite several attempts to arrest Father Thomas, the Jesuit was always warned away by friends and evaded capture, possibly using a fabled underground escape route which was said to exit near the stables at Walton Hall. When Charles's younger brother, William, who is shown here on the left, joined the Jesuits, he was following a family tradition spanning at least the previous 2 generations. His uncle, another Charles, had also been a Jesuit priest, while his uncle Christopher was a Jesuit scholar. His granduncles, Thomas and Francis, were also members of the order, Thomas being an ordained priest. Charles's cousin once removed, George Webb Waterton, who is shown here on the right, would also become a priest, although not a member of the Jesuit order. And this brings us to our second, admittedly somewhat tenuous, link to Waterton's wall. While he was studying with the Jesuits at Stonyhurst, Charles's housemaster was Father Clifford, a relation of Lord Clifford of Ugbrook House in Chudley in Devon. The housemaster advised 14-year-old Charles never to drink wine and spirits during his lifetime. Charles agreed. Some claim Charles became teetotal, but this may not be strictly true, as we're told he did drink a very weak beer until his wife's death. It's well known that Charles would later claim that he paid for the wall around the estate, costing around £10,000 at the time, from the wine that he didn't drink. Therefore, it could be argued that the Jesuits, and more specifically Father Clifford, are responsible for Charles having the financial means to build the wall. Let's consider some of the ways in which Charles's Catholic beliefs were expressed. First, there are his charitable works. As the landlord at Walton Hall, we know that Charles owned much of the farming land around Walton, which was let out to various tenants. Waterton practised tithing, ensuring that a tenth of all his revenue from the lands was given to charity to help the poor. St. Joseph's Acre in Walton was a piece of land which Waterton had earmarked specifically for charitable purposes, and it was said that this land tended to produce the best crops, mainly potatoes. Waterton allowed the poor to fish freely in the lake around the hall, and even encouraged them to use a fisherman's hut nearby to shelter and eat food. In 1826, the year the wall was finished, Charles donated £100 for the use of the poor of Walton to help them through the winter. Waterton also maintained the centuries-old Catholic tradition of blessing the fields on rogation days. Rogation days, from the Latin rogare, meaning to ask, were 4 days a year when prayers were offered to God to ask for his blessing on the land. He arranged for priests to come and perform this rite. Although the picture shown is not one of the rogation ceremonies, I've included it to evoke the kind of image one might have seen as the group passed through the fields. This photograph shows the grotto area of Waterton's estate, courtesy of Wakefield Museums and Castles. We know that Waterton opened his estate for the general public to visit. Notable visitors included inmates of the West Yorkshire Pauper Lunatic Asylum, and also pupils from St Austin's schools. The Leeds Intelligencer newspaper noted, "Coals, crockery, stabling, and so on are all provided at the cost of Mr. Waterton, who makes no secret of the satisfaction he feels at thus being able to minister to the innocent enjoyment of others, or of his conviction that such a course is in every way consistent with a devout Christian character." Charles was known to fast by eating and drinking little on many occasions. His friend Dr. Hobson would remonstrate with him and try and encourage him to eat and drink more for his health. But in terms of drink, Waterton would often restrict himself to water and a very weak tea. He allowed himself sugar but no cream or milk. And unsurprisingly, this was particularly the case during Lent. On one occasion, when invited to dine at a friend's house, he replied, "As we have not yet quite arrived at mid-Lent, you may be sure that the Pope's padlock is still on my grinders." Hobson also tells us that when the Pope removed the padlock from Waterton's grinders at Easter, Waterton occasionally overindulged and ate more than his poor deprived stomach could cope with, resulting in painful and uncomfortable results. Waterton was criticised by his friend Dr. Hobson for having an excess of credulity when it came to some Catholic beliefs. To this, the tablet newspaper responded by stating, Dr. Hobson talks of the credulity with which Mr. Waterton often surprised his Protestant friends. That, translated into Catholic language, means nothing but an ardent and affectionate faith. Julia Blackburn tells us, he took pleasure in being in Catholic countries where he was not despised for his faith, and where he could get his fill of saints' days and processions, and even the occasional miracle. Waterton was delighted to have witnessed the liquefaction of St. Janarius's blood at Naples, remarking it was miraculous beyond the shadow of a doubt. He believed implicitly in the legend of the Holy House, or Santa Casa, in which the home of the Blessed Virgin Mary was said to have been transported through space and time by holy angels from Nazareth in the Holy Land to Loreto in Italy. In Bavaria, he met a famous miracle-working prince who had cured by his prayers Princess Matilda von Schwarzenberg, who had been a paralytic for 8 years. And he went to Bruges in the Jubilee year of 1850, expressly to see the procession of the relic of the Holy Blood of our Redeemer paraded through the streets. Despite his strong faith, Waterton was not beyond having a little fun at the expense of church authorities. In his mid-30s he visited Rome with an old school friend, Captain Edwin Jones. Entering Vatican Square, they encouraged each other to test their skills by climbing up the dome of St. Peter's. And once they got to the top, they went further and scaled the lightning conductors, leaving a pair of gloves at the top as proof of their achievements. The pair then proceeded to Castle Sant'Angelo, where they balanced on one leg on top of one of the angels. The Pope was concerned that the lightning conductor might have been rendered useless by the addition of gloves, and ordered for them to be removed. But since no one was brave enough to climb the dome to retrieve them, it fell to Waterton and Jones to return and take them down the following day, watched by a crowd of fascinated onlookers. So let's talk a little about the Catholic chapel at Walton Hall. There was almost certainly a secret chapel in Walton Hall during recent times, and it was most likely located in the attic. It would have been here that Waterton's ancestors sheltered visiting priests from the authorities, heard Mass, received the sacrament safe from prying eyes. We even have the names of some of these priests who served in the chapel over the years. When Charles's father Thomas rebuilt the hall in about 1768, he took the opportunity to establish a new chapel on the top floor of the hall. In 1791, the building of Catholic chapels and churches became permissible by law, and Thomas immediately registered the family chapel at the quarter sessions in Rotherham on July the 20th, 1791. The registration is shown on the slide here. The Waterton family opened up this chapel to the Catholics of Wakefield, and we know that Father Charles Lefebvre from Leeds visited Walton Hall during the 1810s and 1820s and said Mass at the hall both for Waterton and for local Catholics. Likewise, when Father John George Morris arrived in 1827, he records that he said Mass at the hall on Sundays and Mondays for between 60 to 70 Catholics present in the town. Now there seems to be some debate and confusion in biographies and other writings as to the nature and the number of chapels at Walton Hall. 3 chapels in all seem to be mentioned, so let's explore each one in turn. The first was mentioned by J.G. Wood in the biography of Waterton in the 1879 edition of Wanderings in South America. In this he states, on the western side of the gateway there had been a curious old chapel formerly attached to the mansion. Waterton, however, disliked it, and took it down against the remonstrances of the then Duke of Norfolk, his godfather. So if this is correct, there was once a chapel somewhere near the Watergate on the island. One can imagine this would have interfered with views to and from the new hall once the old mansion had been demolished. Either way, as no archaeological investigations have ever taken place on the island, we can't really confirm or deny the existence of such a chapel. No other references to it seem to have been found. The second group of references discuss a chapel on the ground floor. The earliest reference to this that I have found is by Goss in his book The Squire of Walton Hall, dated 1940. In this he states that the ground floor chapel abutted onto the house. The source of the statement is not referenced, but a further entry discusses a strange occurrence at Waterton's funeral. After the service the altar of Our Lady caught fire and blazed up, and for a short while it seemed as if the hall itself might be set on fire and burnt down, but fortunately the flames were extinguished in time. Now if this event really took place, I would imagine it to be significant enough to have been reported in the local press. There are after all many accounts of the funeral itself, but no other reference to this exists. Goss may have been confusing the chapel at Walton Hall with that built at Deeping Waterton, the later home of Edmund Waterton. This indeed had an external chapel dedicated to Our Lady, and the hall was involved in a fire some years before Goss wrote his book. Some later authors have seized on Goss's reference to the ground floor chapel and repeated it, assuming that the chapel on the upper floor was just Waterton's private domain. The building possibly being confused and misidentified as a ground floor chapel abutting the building may be what was referred to by some as the arcade. It is shown here in an early photograph at the rear of the hall. When Edmund Waterton returned to Walton Hall, he had a memorial cross to his deceased daughter Amabel Waterton erected in the form of a cross on the wall there. It can still be seen near Charlie's Bar. A visitor to the hall in the 1890s wrote in the local press, "In the arcade is the grave of Amabel in what was intended to have been a chapel. A stone slab and a simple cross is all that appears." So perhaps Edmund intended to turn the arcade into a ground floor chapel, but ran out of money and left the area before this could be done. This would certainly support the rationale of placing the memorial to his daughter in this location. The chapel mentioned most often by both Charles and his contemporaries is that located on the top floor of the house, and after consideration I've come to believe this was actually the only chapel in the hall during Charles's time. Shown on the screen is a speculative plan of the top floor of Walton Hall, showing where the chapel may have been, and on the left an enlarged plan of the possible layout of the chapel itself. You'll see in a moment what evidence this is based on. When I was investigating the issue of the chapel, I was initially convinced that there must have been a chapel on the ground floor, as authors suggest. Would Waterton really have wanted people traipsing through his home to get to the chapel upstairs? Surely the one in the upper floor, near his bedroom, would have just been his own private chapel, as some later authors have suggested. But with the help of others, I was able to locate evidence which highlights how big the chapel on the top floor of the hall must have been. When he let the hall in 1870, Edmund Waterton left a detailed inventory of every room in the hall and its contents. Remember, this is only 5 years after Charles's death, so it's unlikely there were many enormous structural changes during that time. He makes no reference at all to a chapel on the ground floor, but on the top floor he refers to a chapel, a sacristy, and the priest's bedroom. The size of the chapel can be estimated based on its contents, which were listed as an altar of carved oak, a large oak cross, an oak tabernacle with a crucifix on top, 10 benches, 15 chapel chairs, 2 Venetian glass chandeliers, 2 side chandeliers made of metal, a sanctuary lamp, a statue of our Lord, 2 statues of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Christ Child, 2 statues of St. Joseph, and so on and so on and so on. So the chapel must certainly have been of substantial size to contain all these items. You can see in the plan on the left, the layout indicates the 10 benches and the 15 chapel chairs shown. With this in mind, it's perhaps not surprising that the chapel received a positive review during a diocesan inspection by Bishop Robert Cornthwaite in 1863. He noted that the chapel was well and suitably placed. The plate, linen, and vestments are complete, abundant, and good. Permission for the Blessed Sacrament to be reserved in the chapel in a tabernacle had been granted by an indult of Pope Pius IX. However, Bishop Cornthwaite makes a note of concern that the key to the tabernacle was not locked in a safe but left easily accessible in the chalice box, and women are permitted to assist at Mass without wearing a head covering. We'll move now to say a few words about St. Austin's Church. And from 1823 to 1828, efforts were being put into the establishment of St. Austin's Catholic Chapel, as it was then called, in Wakefield. Charles Waterton and his brother William, a Jesuit priest, both gave money towards the building of St. Austin's. The Watertons appeared to have sold their shares in the Barnsley Canal in order to raise some of the money for donating to this worthy cause. Even more importantly, Charles and William, along with a selection of other well-to-do priests associated with the Jesuit order, signed 2 agreements relating to the sale of the land on which St. Austin's was to be built. This was crucial to the building project and ensured that it could proceed. Waterton also had very close links with many of the priests of St. Austin's. We've already mentioned Father John George Morris, who was the first priest to be in the parish and probably got on very well with Charles because he had an interest in horticulture. He was the first chair of the Wakefield Horticulture Society and promoted gardening as a good alternative to going to the public house. This attitude would also likely find favour with Charles, who we know wasn't a drinker. Even when Father Morris had left St. Austin's, we know he came back to visit Walton Hall, as in 1851 Waterton mentions him in a letter to his friend George Ord. Father Morris's successor, Father Francis Jarrett, was also a visitor to Walton Hall, and Waterton wrote on one occasion to Eliza Edmonston, "As Father Jarrett is here to dine with us and has offered to convey letters to the post, I lose no time in answering." Although he's not actually named, Father Jarrett is almost certainly one of the 4 Jesuit priests who participated in the funeral of Waterton's close friend, the senior Jesuit Father Thomas Glover, S.J., who died exhausted at Walton Hall at the end of May 1849, and who was buried in the Waterton vault at St. Helen's Church. Father John Barron is not named as a visitor to the hall, but we know that Edmund Waterton took part in the town debates which elected him as salaried Catholic chaplain at Wakefield Prison. He was also one of the priests present at Waterton's funeral in 1865. We know that Charles Waterton's support for St. Austin's Church was not limited to just building and establishing the parish. He continued to contribute to the church in different ways during his life and was an attendee on a regular basis. Francis Henry Salvin, a friend of Waterton's and well-known writer on falconry, once wrote in a letter, "At the time the squire went to Wakefield on Sundays to attend divine service." Another witness was Major Goodyear, head teacher of Ings Road School. He wrote later, "I have often seen him walking up Kirkgate to attend the Catholic Church, and I well remember his blue swallow-tailed coat with gold buttons. He walked but sent his servants by carriage." Again, this is confirmed by an account relating to the chestnut tree. In 1842, the landlord of the Chestnut Tree, which is now the College Pub on Northgate, applied somewhat belatedly for a licence to sell alcohol, and his application included the note, "Mr. Waterton had to leave his carriage at this house whilst he attended the Catholic chapel." Mr. Terry read a certificate signed by this gentleman and several other gentlemen who came from Woolton and Rothwell to attend the Catholic chapel, and by members of that place of worship who have come from a distance, all agreeing that it would be a great convenience to them and the public if a licence was granted. Shortly after the opening of St Austin's in 1828, Charles Waterton married Anne Mary Edmonston, the daughter of one of his old friends and business associates. Reading the contemporary accounts, there's little doubt that Charles had genuine affection for his new wife, and indeed his new sisters-in-law, who also became part of the family. Not being Catholics, his fiancée Anne and her sister Helen spent time at the Catholic convent in Bruges, pictured here, where Charles's great-aunt Mary Augustine Moore had been Mother Superior in earlier times. Charles and Anne were married there in April 1829, but had to undergo a further ceremony at St Helens in Sandal in December the same year, as their Catholic marriage was not legal in England. In April 1830, after a difficult pregnancy, Anne gave birth to a son, Edmund, but all was not well, and she took to her sickbed suffering from childbed fever, puerperal sepsis caused by an infection of the womb during childbirth. Without modern medicine, there was little chance of her survival. Anne's final days were spent in bed, attended by Waterton, his doctors, and Waterton's sister Helen Carr. Another regular visitor was Father John George Morris. It was he who gave Anne the sacrament of the sick, and would have heard her final confession before her death. It was also no doubt Father Morris who celebrated Requiem Mass for Anne at the Walton Hall Chapel before she was taken to St Helens in Sandal to be interred in the Waterton family vault. Father Morris was also tasked with writing to Anne's friends, the sisters at the English convent in Bruges, to inform them of her passing. "Dear Madam, I write with extreme grief to acquaint you with the death of our dear friend Mrs. Waterton. She expired this morning shortly after midnight, fortified with the consoling rites and sacraments of our divine religion, which she received with a faith, resignation, and devotion greater, I think, than I have ever before witnessed. I can hardly describe the very great application of her dear husband. Did not religion lend its aid, the shock would be too much for him to bear. I am seriously alarmed for his health." Waterton's good friend, Captain Joseph Wood of Sandal, was among the first to offer sympathies. A veteran of the British Army and a gentleman landowner in Sandal, Wood was a convert to the Catholic faith and hence a fellow parishioner at St Austin's. He often stood with Waterton speaking out against the Protestant Reformation Society at several of their meetings in Wakefield, and seeing his friend so distressed by his young wife's death, he wrote a moving poem of condolence. "Weep not for her, my friend, whose faithful love false hope once promised to thy future years, who, robed in innocence in realms above, unchanged in youth and loveliness appears." The image on the left is the old St Anne's Church, and on the right one of its most long-standing priests, Canon Richard Brown. Before St Austin's was built in 1828, and when no chaplain was available at the hall, Waterton would travel to Leeds to attend Mass. It may have been on one such visit that he met his long-standing friend Dr. Richard Hobson, who lived mere yards away from St Anne's in Park Place, where the current town hall now stands. He struck up a friendship with the priests of St Anne's and was concerned for their well-being, especially in 1847 when typhus raged through the town and hit the Catholic Irish areas very severely. In less than 1 year, 5 priests from St Anne's lost their lives to typhus after ministering to the poor, and these included Father Walmsley and Father Wilson, who were both well known to Waterton. With all 5 priests of St Anne's dead of typhus, they were replaced by the man on the right, Father Richard Brown, who later became Canon Brown. He volunteered to go to Leeds, leaving the safety of his previous posting at Everingham Hall in York, despite knowing the fate of his 5 predecessors, a brave man. He stayed in the city for 55 years and became very good friends with Waterton, who described him as his confessor and invited him to Walton on many occasions. The other priests from St Anne's also attended Walton Hall and said Mass for Waterton in the chapel in the later years of his life. Robert Cornthwaite, the Catholic Bishop of Beverley, and effectively Canon Brown's boss, was another regular visitor and could often be seen on warm days in his purple cassock sitting on the lawn in front of the hall. Bishop Cornthwaite's boss, Cardinal Wiseman, also visited on at least one occasion. It was therefore perhaps not surprising that it was Canon Richard Brown who was sent for when Charles faced the end of his life. Lydia Edmonston was sent to St Austin's in Wakefield to fetch the holy oils required for the last rites. Waterton's son Edmund was working in Rome at the time in service at the Vatican, and he too was contacted. Shortly afterwards a telegram arrived in response from none other than Pope Pius IX, sending his benedictions for Waterton. Meanwhile, Waterton's friend and confessor, Canon Richard Brown, arrived from St Anne's in Leeds in time to offer and administer the sacrament of the sick or last rites. Waterton died clutching a crucifix made of bronze and malachite, which had once belonged to Cardinal Henry Stuart, the grandson of King James II, the last Catholic King of England. Incidentally, the picture here is of Cardinal Henry Stuart, likely wearing that same crucifix. He was referred to by the Jacobites as King Henry IX of England, and he was the last of King James II's heirs to publicly claim the British throne. Given Charles Waterton's own grandfather's efforts to support the Jacobite cause, it's probably appropriate that Charles had such link to this crucifix. Charles's funeral, a few days later, had too many mourners to fit into the Walton Hall family chapel. The entrance hall was used instead, and the Requiem Mass took place there with the hall decked out in black velvet. Waterton's friend Bishop Robert Cornthwaite was seen here top left. He officiated at the Mass assisted by 14 priests. These included Waterton's close friend and confessor, Canon Richard Brown, seen in the middle here, and the 2 priests from St Austin's parish, Father John Barron and Father Alfred White, here seen on the right. Once Waterton had been laid to rest in his woodland grave, a final act of charity was enacted. He had arranged for 83 poor men and women of the locality to receive 6pence and a loaf of bread on the occasion of his funeral. This part of the ceremony took place at the gates of Walton Hall and was officiated by Father Alfred White of St Austin's. Father White continued his friendship with the Waterton family after Charles's death. Edmund invited him to be the chief celebrant at the nuptial mass for his second marriage to Ellen Mercer in November 1881. Also present at the funeral was Charles's nephew, Father George Webb Waterton, the son of Charles's cousin Henry. He'd been ordained a few years earlier and was serving as assistant priest in Durham. Charles had shunned burial in the family crypt at St Helens in favour of a spot on the Walton Hall estate. His somewhat worse for wear grave and its cross stand on the spot even today, bearing witness to his life. For those searching for other lasting symbols of Waterton's Catholic faith in Wakefield today, we can obviously point to St Austin's Church on Wentworth Terrace. Of course, eventually there would have been a Catholic church built in Wakefield without Waterton, but Waterton helped speed along the process, and his influence and finances helped to ensure the quality of the building in what even today is a fairly prestigious area of the city. Let's also not forget the large crucifix hiding in plain sight above the ivy on the old Walton Hall watergate. It was elevated and blessed by Bishop Robert Cornthwaite the year before Waterton's death. But that isn't quite the end of the story of Waterton's connections to the parish of St Austin's. In 1964, almost 100 years after Charles's death, his last surviving granddaughter, Ethelberg Maria Magdalene Parger Scrope, got in touch with the parish priest at the time, Monsignor Henry Thompson, to offer a gift of a chalice and paten which had been crafted in 1903 at the request of Edmund Waterton and his second wife, Ellen Mercer, for her parents, the Mercer family of Alston Hall in Preston. The chalice and paten were inherited by Ethelberga on her grandparents' and parents' death, and she'd hoped to hand them on to one of her 5 sons, had any of them discerned a priestly vocation. However, they all joined the army, and therefore Ethelberga, through her son Major Geoffrey Scrope of the Green Howards, donated the chapel and paten to St Austin's Church, recognising the special place the parish had for both her father and grandfather. They're now safely held in possession of the Diocese of Leeds. So thank you for listening. I hope you found this short exploration of the Catholic side of Charles Waterton's life in Wakefield both interesting and informative. I've listed some of the main sources for the presentation on the slide here, but suffice it to say that although some of the information I've provided is my own research, a lot of it isn't and comes from these sources listed. If you have an interest in the history of St Austin's Parish, we have a series of historical talks running through to 2028, our 200th anniversary. These are placed on our YouTube page after each presentation, and you're welcome to join at any time, virtually or in person. We'll be adding this presentation and any others to this site. We can also offer a paper copy of a book on this talk with much more additional information called Rats, Recusants, Royalty and Religion, The Catholic Life of Charles Waterton. You can obtain a copy in the back of St Austin's Church in the Narthex shop or via Amazon. Thank you for listening.